My name is Savannah Hale, and everyone thinks my life is perfect. And maybe it is. To anyone looking from the outside. To those who see the dresses lined up by color in my closet, the smiling photos in society columns, the gala dinners where I know exactly what to say, when to smile, and how to cross my legs without seeming too delicate. I was born to fit. Molded so carefully that sometimes even I believed the illusion. Daughter of politicians, granddaughter of a federal judge, goddaughter of CEOs. My last name carries more weight than any jewel they've ever hung around my neck. And for a long time, I thought that weight was what made me strong. But then, he showed up, and everything I thought was solid started to crack. It was an ordinary afternoon, or at least it was supposed to be. A charity event, one of those affairs filled with rehearsed speeches, flashing cameras, and inflated donations to soothe the consciences of the wealthy. I just slipped out to the back, claiming I needed air when I heard the music. A raw, jagged melody, unpretentious, not trying to impress anyone, just truth in strings and voice. And there he was, sitting on the sidewalk, a guitar in his arms, eyes closed like he was singing to someone who only existed in memory. A faded cap, road-worn boots, ripped jeans, everything about him screamed far from my world, and yet I couldn't look away. When he opened his eyes and saw me, he didn't say a word, just kept playing, as if he already knew I wouldn't leave, as if he'd recognized something in me I didn't even know how to name. I sat down, without thinking. We stayed silent for a while, and it was the first silence in years that didn't feel suffocating. He asked my name, and for the first time in forever I lied. I said it was Anna. He smiled, said it suited me, and kept playing. I didn't go back to the party that day. When I finally stood, my legs were shaky, not from fear, but from something I didn't yet understand. All I knew was that from that moment on, something inside me had shifted. Something that wouldn't slide back into its old place. His name, I'd only learn days later. Eli Monroe, the wandering troubadour. And without knowing it, he'd just sung the first note of my liberation. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it had been just a moment. A beautiful pause in the suffocating script of my life, a fluke. But the truth was, the sound of that voice, rough, imperfect, alive, kept trailing me like an echo that wouldn't fade. I'd catch myself thinking of him at the oddest times, in the middle of a meeting with my father's aides, while my mother droned on about wedding lists, even during etiquette lessons with Aunt Elizabeth, where everything was timed, contained, and cold. Something in me had been touched, not physically, but somewhere deeper, a place I thought had been buried under layers of exemplary behavior. By Thursday, I went back, not because I'm brave, but because the unease outweighed the fear. I went to the same spot at the same time, and there he was, Eli, playing to no one like he was the last man on earth and music was his only way to keep existing. When he saw me, he smiled with his eyes but didn't stop what he was doing. Just gave a slight nod as if to say, I knew you'd come back. I sat beside him again, and this time he didn't ask my name. He just started showing me his songs, not like he was trying to impress, but like he was sharing scars. He didn't talk much, and maybe that's why every word he said felt chosen with care. As if, in his world, silence had value too. Little by little, I started shedding some of the layers that always protected me. I didn't tell him whose daughter I was. I didn't mention the engagement ring hidden in my drawer. I didn't bring up the carefully crafted plans for my future with a man everyone deemed ideal. There, next to Eli, I was just a woman sitting on the ground, listening to someone sing about places I'd never seen and pains I secretly knew. And that was more freeing than any feminist lecture at the elite prep school my mother forced me to attend when I was 16. He saw me without the Polish. And the scariest part was I wanted to be seen that way. We started meeting regularly, always out of sight from the world that surrounded me. No one knew. And for a while, that secret was sweet, like a hidden garden inside me where things bloomed that didn't fit in the concrete life built around me over decades. But even in the prettiest hiding spot, time grows too many roots. And I could already feel that soon, one way or another, some part of this parallel world would spill into the other. The real, visible, cruel one. I tried to hold steady in both versions of myself, but it was like cupping water in my hands. One always slipped through, and the one slipping, no doubt, was the one they'd created. Then came the engagement dinner, lavish, flawless, full of smiles that didn't reach the eyes. On the outside, Savannah Hale, the perfect daughter, the model bride-to-be. Inside, Anna, the woman who heard her own soul for the first time, de in. A stranger's melody screamed in silence. While they toasted to the future, all I could think of was the sound of his voice saying, "Freedom isn't the absence of weight, it's knowing what's worth carrying." And in that moment, the ring they slipped onto my finger felt more like a shackle than a promise. I didn't cry. I didn't run. But at the first chance I got, I went back to him. And that night, beside Eli, while the world slept oblivious to my absence, I spoke my first truth aloud. "My name isn't Anna." He smiled, unsurprised. I know. That's when I understood. He'd never needed my name to recognize who I was. The next morning, the silence in the house felt thicker, as if it knew what I'd done, as if the air carried the scent of betrayal, even though no one had said a word yet. My mother talked about flowers, dresses, invitations. My father read the paper with his usual distant, untouchable expression, but there was something different in the way he folded each page. Slower, like he was waiting to find some hint that the world around him was slipping out of his grasp. I sat at the table, the taste of the night before still caught in my throat. Eli wouldn't leave my skin, the way he looked at me, the way he listened, the way he played like every note said exactly what I'd never dared admit. And still, I stayed there, in my role. Because the part of me trained to please knew exactly what to do. Knew how to smile with empty eyes. Knew how to feign interest in flowers that meant nothing. Knew how to thank compliments without feeling present in them. But while the world carried on with its perfect performance, my body seemed ready to bolt from inside me. I walked through the house's halls with light feet, like I might run at any second. And maybe I would have. I started seeing him more, not every day, not as often as I wanted, but in the moments when the emptiness pressed hardest, Eli didn't demand anything. Never asked why I took so long to come back. Never pushed me to explain where I'd been or who I'd been with. And maybe that's what threw me most. He gave me space, and yet all I wanted was to stay. Sometimes we sat in silence, for hours. Other times he'd show me lyrics scribbled in battered notebooks, in handwriting both beautiful and wounded. Some were about me, I knew it. He never said so, but they were there. Lines about eyes that lie by day and weep at night, about women trapped in invisible castles, about voices muffled by the names they carry. I listened with a lump in my throat, because he described me without pointing at me, and that hurt more than any direct judgment. He saw my cages without shaming me for them, showed me without exposing me, and with that, I started losing my fear of seeing myself too. But living between two worlds comes at a cost. And mine started weighing on me when Michael, the fiancé my parents picked, began noticing my emotional absence. He wasn't stupid. And despite being the right man on paper, he wasn't blind. He'd look at me like he was trying to figure out why I kept growing more distant, colder, more real. One day he asked outright if there was someone else. I lied. And the lie hurt me more than it hurt him. Because in that moment I realized what kept me tied to that life wasn't fear anymore. It was guilt. Guilt for letting down everyone who'd bet so much on me. Guilt for carrying the name I did and still wanting something no one around me would call love. I went back to Eli that night, and when he saw me, he didn't ask a thing. Just pulled me close and held me like he knew something in me had broken, and I cried. Cried without saying why. Cried without needing to explain. And he stayed there, holding me like the whole world could collapse, and he still wouldn't let go. It was there, in his arms, that I understood. Loving someone isn't so much about escaping the world as it is about being seen, even when you're in pieces. I still didn't know what I'd do, didn't know how to get out. But in that moment, I knew I couldn't keep pretending my life was on the right track, because for the first time, something inside me was screaming too loud to ignore, and that scream had his name. Guilt became a second skin. I smiled for photos, shook important hands, rehearsed speeches for interviews and events, all with the perfection of someone molded to represent a dynasty. And yet, every gesture felt like a role I played from a distance, like I was watching my own life through thick glass. Time with Eli stayed hidden, and even hidden it was the only place I could breathe. But the more the real world closed in, the more the fantasy became unsustainable, not because it was unreal, but because it was, in fact, the truest part of me. The questions started coming harder, whispered comments among family, stares that lingered too long at dinners, invitations to meetings that felt more like delicately veiled interrogations. My mother tried to keep up appearances, but fear trembled in her movements. My father grew more direct. Michael, once reserved, began confronting me with the quiet anger of someone who feels betrayed but can't prove it. And me? I was splitting in two. One side fighting to fulfill everything expected of me, the other, nearly whole, wanting to run to Eli and say I was ready. Ready to drop everything, even without knowing what came next. I started feeling like an intruder in my own home. The dress I wore to a charity event felt tighter than usual. The heels hurt more. The sound of camera flashes made me sick, and the speeches, the ones I knew by heart, began to wound me with their fakeness. At one of those events, I received a Young Inspiration Award. They said I was an example of commitment, elegance, strength, and I stood tall, smiled on cue, thanked them politely. But inside, my throat burned, because I knew the truth. All of it was a fantasy built on versions of me that never really existed. I wasn't inspiration. I was suffocating. I went back to Eli with trembling hands and a racing heart. He was sitting, as always, scribbling lyrics that only made sense once he sang them. When I got close, he didn't smile, just looked at me and said low, "You're almost at the end, aren't you?" And I fell apart. I sat on the ground, rested my head on his knee, and let the weight pour out in silence. There was no room left to keep up appearances. There, with him, I didn't have to be an example. I could just exist. Eli didn't push me, but I saw in his eyes the pain of someone who knew every time I came back was also a delayed goodbye. And the worst part was, he never asked me to stay. Never begged, never backed me into a corner. He tasdim, just was, whole, true, ready. And that hurt more than if he'd demanded something, because everything in me wanted to stay, but everything around me demanded I remain where I was born. Then came the day Michael caught me leaving. My hair was still loose. I was wearing the oversized shirt Eli had lent me, and my eyes were puffy from a sleepless night. He didn't yell, just looked at me like he was finally confirming what he'd always suspected, and said, his voice cold, "You chose to be a disgrace." I didn't answer, because he was right. To the world he stood for, I was a disappointment. But for the first time, that didn't paralyze me. I didn't cry. I didn't apologize. I just looked back and said, "Then let me be." I went home, climbed to my room, and locked the door. The engagement ring sat on the dresser, untouched for days. I picked it up, studied the perfectly calculated gleam of its cut. It was beautiful, but it stood for everything I didn't want anymore. I took a deep breath and knew. Something in me had turned. Something in me wasn't coming back. I just needed the courage to listen to what my heart was already screaming and act before it was too late. Those days stretched longer than any season I'd ever lived. Inside the mansion, the air weighed like lead, and the walls seemed to listen to every thought I didn't dare voice. The staff moved around me in silence, more reserved than usual, like they knew something in me was about to give. My father didn't say a word beyond what was necessary, but his eyes carried the cold steel of someone realizing he's losing control. And my mother, though gentler, had the blank stare of someone choosing to ignore the obvious, as if love mattered less than keeping the order that had always held everything together. Michael didn't reach out for 3 days, and when he finally did, he came with measured words and glassy eyes. He spoke of honor, duty, promises sealed between families long before I could even say my own name. His voice didn't waver, but there was a quiet rage in every pause, like the idea of losing what he thought was his hurt more than the idea of never being loved by me. He accused me with the elegance of men in our world. No shouting, just sharp words that cut more cleanly than any blade. I didn't deny it. I didn't say he was wrong, because he wasn't. What existed between me and Eli couldn't stay hidden in secret gardens or between the notes of his music anymore. It was in my body, my eyes, the way I couldn't smile at banquets anymore. It was in the silence I carried when I came back from seeing him, and the lightness that lasted only until the mansion doors closed behind me. And still, I kept pretending, not out of cowardice, but habit, because I'd been trained to withstand everything except my own desire. One night, with the wind blowing like an omen, my father summoned me to his study, where he kept the family seals and signed contracts that shaped our legacy. He sat at the desk and didn't offer me a chair. His face impassive. He said the wedding date would be moved up, that the family couldn't live under the shadow of rumors, and a hesitant daughter made an unworthy wife. He didn't ask how I felt, didn't demand explanations, just decreed, as it always was, as it always would be if I let it. I didn't answer, just lowered my eyes like I'd done my whole life. But inside, something broke for good, not with violence, with clarity. I left the room with steady steps, cold hands, a racing heart, and climbed to my room like I carried a decision too big for my body. I shut the door and stripped off every adornment with the slowness of a ritual, undid my hair, washed my face, and stared into the polished dresser mirror. For the first time, I saw not the promised daughter, but the woman at war. I stayed up all night, sitting by the window, watching the dark, starless sky, and for the first time, I wished for a storm, for it to take everything, to tear down the walls around me, the expectations, the titles, the vows that were never mine. I thought of Eli, the warmth of his hands, the way he said my name, not as a formality but a prayer. I thought of his quiet laugh, his freedom, and I knew I couldn't leave him behind, not because he was an escape, but because with him, I stopped being a shadow. When the sky began to lighten, I stood, grabbed a plain coat, untied the engagement ring from the chain around my neck, and left it on the pillow. I didn't write a note, didn't ask forgiveness, didn't leave a trace, because in that moment there was nothing left to explain. I walked out of the mansion with light feet but a heavy chest, full of everything I was leaving, not just the walls and halls, but the version of me bred to serve. Please, obey. I moved through the shadows like the world had finally gone quiet to hear me, and as I crossed the boundaries of everything I'd ever known, I knew there was no going back. The princess stayed behind. Now I was just me. I found Eli before the sun hit the treetops. He was at the edge of the clearing where we'd meet, sitting on a moss-covered rock, tuning his guitar like he always did, as if time, pain, and the whole world could be fixed with patience and tight strings. When he saw me, he didn't move right away. His eyes traced my face, my loose hair, the simple coat over the dress I'd left the mansion in, and only then did he breathe deeper, like he'd been holding it since the last time we met. I walked to him without a word. My body shook, not from cold, but from the weight of what I'd left behind. The halls, the titles, the vows, and the faces that always demanded obedience, control, perfection. Eli watched me with the care of someone who knows the value of a quiet gesture, and when I stopped in front of him, eyes locked on his, he just asked, "Did you come for you?" I nodded. Yes, for the first time, yes. He stood slowly, like any sudden move might shatter the moment. He reached out his hand, not as an invitation, but a sharing. I took it firmly, and in that silent touch, everything between us stopped, being a secret. It wasn't a tired princess's refuge anymore. It was the choice of a woman who finally recognized herself outside the bars that raised her. We left without rushing. It wasn't running, though the world would see it that way. It was rebirth. Each step took us farther from what held us back, but closer to everything we didn't know if we could sustain. Freedom was raw. It didn't come with comfort or guarantees. We slept under open skies, ate what we could scrape together from coins tossed by people who stopped to hear Eli play. I traded my clean, courtly hands for days of calluses and dirt, and still, I felt nobler than I ever had. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes I missed the sheltered silence of the mansion, the certainty of hot water, the taste of fresh fruit from the orchard. But then Eli would sing, sometimes for me, sometimes just because he couldn't keep quiet inside. And the sound of his notes reminded me that everything I had now was real. Not won, not inherited, chosen. Slowly I stopped being recognized. The road dust, the tangled hair, the worn dress. People no longer saw a princess. They saw just a woman. And strangely, that gave me peace. Because in that rough, weary anonymity, there was a dignity the spotlight never offered. One day, sitting by a lake with the sky flushed at dusk, Eli took my hand and said, "You know you can go back if you want. I won't stop you." I looked at him with the quiet certainty that had grown in me along the roads and replied, "I didn't leave my home, Eli. I left my prison." He didn't say anything, just pulled me close, and we stayed there, the world watching without a sound. And that's when I realized it wasn't about running anymore. It was about living for the first time without fear of being who I was. And if that path led me through rough trails, hardships, and judgment, so be it. Because I'd rather walk over stones with free feet than tread marble with bound wrists. My name was still the same, but now it wasn't a title. It was my story, whole, unedited, unmasked. The politician's daughter, the runaway, the woman who chose to love, even if the world didn't approve, and finally, the woman who didn't ask permission to be free.